if you
As
want
you
to.
know, there are several clinical trials currently enrolling people for PWS for their studies. Some of these trials are investigational drugs, others are behavioral interventions. A list of trials is available on fpwr.org, and I encourage you to visit this site to learn more about the opportunities that are available. Today's guest presenter is Dr. Eric Hollander from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, who will be telling us more about the CBDV study he is currently running. We will be collecting questions from the audience throughout the webinar, and we'll answer all of your questions after the short presentation. Without further delay, I give you Dr. Eric Hollander.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here. So again, my name is Eric Hollander, and I'm at Albert Einstein College of Medicine and Montefiore Medical Center in New York. And I'm going to be talking about a study that we're doing comparing CBDV, cannabidivarin, which is a new cannabinoid compound, versus placebo in children and in young adults up to age 30 who have Prader-Willi syndrome. And I'm very grateful for the funding that we've received from the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research. And I'm grateful for the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research for allowing us to do this webinar, which can help to recruit for subjects who are eligible and could benefit from the particular study. If I could have the next slide, please. So last week we presented on a study that we're doing, which is funded by the Orphan Products Division of the Food and Drug Administration, on intranasal oxytocin to target in particular the hyperphagia associated with Prader-Willi syndrome. And today I'm going to be talking about the use of CBDV, cannabidivarin. And this study in particular targets certain symptom domains in Prader-Willi syndrome, in particular the irritability that individuals can manifest, the repetitive and rigid type of behaviors, as well as some of the social cognition difficulties. Turns out that both the CBDV, cannabidivarin, and oxytocin both have some similar mechanisms of action in that they seem to have a therapeutic effect on this excitation inhibition imbalance that may be present in PWS. And both of the compounds also seem to dampen down this immune inflammatory response. And decreasing the immune inflammatory response may also be helpful in Prader-Willi syndrome. One aspect of these studies also is that we're looking at a particular scale called the MERS PWS, or the Montefiore-Einstein Rigidity Scale for Prader-Willi syndrome. And in this scale, we look at issues in terms of rigidity, which is sort of underappreciated, but still can be a significant problem in Prader-Willi syndrome. And other studies are also looking at genes that may be associated with that rigidity kind of domain in Prader-Willi. Next slide. So CBDV, or cannabidivarin, is a phytocannabinoid. So what that means is that it's a plant-based cannabinoid. It comes from the cannabis plant and is extracted, but is one of over 150 different sort of metabolites or chemicals that can be seen in the plant. In the study, this particular plant-based cannabinoid CBDV may have different behavioral targets, and we'll talk about that. There's some evidence that the endocannabinoid system, which is the endogenous cannabinoid system, may play a role in different kinds of developmental disorders, where this endocannabinoid system may be activated. And activation of this endogenous cannabinoid system may be associated with some of the symptoms that we see, and administering a plant-based cannabinoid or a phytocannabinoid might sort of help in terms of resetting this system. The phytocannabinoids don't work through the same receptors that are seen in the endocannabinoid system. So in the endogenous cannabinoid system, we have a CB1 receptor that's in the brain, and we have a CB2 receptor that's throughout the body in the immune system. And this plant-based cannabinoid, or the CBDV, doesn't seem to exert its effects through the cannabinoid 1 or the cannabinoid 2 receptor. It seems to have effects on different membrane receptors like this GPR55 receptor or TRP receptor. So it seems to work differently than, for example, THC. And a positive effect of this compound is that it seems to reduce excitation in the cortex and in the brain, and to enhance inhibitory tone. And this balance between excitation and inhibition may also be reflected by a balance between glutamate excitation and GABA inhibition in the brain. Cannabidivarin, or CBDV, does not have any THC, and THC is the plant cannabinoid that gets you high, whereas the CBDV really doesn't have any psychoactive effects, doesn't have any THC, and really doesn't get you high. So it's not really medical marijuana. Medical marijuana has significant THC levels in it. This compound, CBDV, really has almost no THC, and then therefore is really quite different than medical marijuana. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, I mentioned that THC can get you high, and THC is the compound in cannabis that has these psychoactive effects and can also be associated with certain side effects. So some people who use a lot of THC or cannabis can have psychotic-like symptoms or anxiety symptoms, or they can have problems with sleep. It turns out that CBDV seems to have opposite or reciprocal effects to THC. So the CBDV has an anticonvulsant effect. It stops seizures. It has an anti-inflammatory effect, so it reduces this immune inflammatory response. It decreases oxidative stress. The CBDV actually has an antipsychotic and anti-anxiety effects, and can have some anti-addictive effects, and also positive effects in terms of neuroprotection, for example. Next slide. Also, CBDV, cannabidivarin, is very different from CBD that you can buy in a drugstore or online. First, when people get CBD online or in different venues, that's completely unregulated. And there are a lot of variation with regards to the what's actually found in the product. So when you buy CBD online, for example, over the counter, sometimes there are high levels of the CBD metabolite, but sometimes there can be high levels of THC, sometimes there can be low levels of CBD. So there's not a lot of standardization, and they're not manufactured under good manufacturing processes. So there can be a lot of variability in what you're actually administering. The only particular brand of CBD that's approved by the Food and Drug Administration is one type of CBD which is manufactured by GW Pharma called Epidiolex. And Epidiolex is a particular brand that's been extracted from the cannabis plant and has high purity of CBD with little THC. And that is approved by the Food and Drug Administration to treat two rare forms of epilepsy. One is called Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and the other is called Dravet syndrome. So those are two rare forms of epilepsy where patients may not respond to the standard anti-epileptic type treatments, and the FDA has approved this Epidiolex to treat seizures in those two rare forms of epilepsy. This CBDV is manufactured under good manufacturing processes. It's very pure. It doesn't include THC. It's highly regulated and has high purity. And there's an investigative brochure associated with this particular compound that documents exactly what are the possible side effects that you can see and what are the dose ranges have been administered in different populations as well. And in the study that we're doing, we're using this form of CBDV, cannabidivarin, and we have a investigational new drug application that's been approved by the Food and Drug Administration to study its use specifically in Prader-Willi syndrome with specific dosing associated with the study. Next slide. So in our study, what are the outcome measures that we're using? First of all, we're looking at the impact that CBDV may have on symptoms of irritability. That's our primary outcome. It turns out that we've also done some studies with CBDV in patients with autism spectrum disorder. And we're also studying to see what impact CBDV has on this irritability measure in patients with autism spectrum disorder. And in this particular study that we're talking about now, it's a study of children and adults with Prader-Willi syndrome. First, we're looking to see whether we can reduce irritability. Irritability includes things like disruptive behaviors. It can include aggression. It can include self-injury, for example, like biting your hand, for example, or banging your head. And it can include things like problems with emotion regulation or temper tantrums or meltdowns. The next measure that we're looking at is the impact of this compound, the CBDV, on repetitive behaviors. And we have two outcome measures that we're looking at. One is this RBSR, the Repetitive Behavior Scale modified. And we're looking at this CY box scale. So those are both measures of repetitive behaviors that are helpful in individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome. Next, we're looking at the impact of CBDV on the hyperphagia symptoms. It turns out that CBD and CBDV may have some positive effects on reducing compulsive eating or appetite, and may have some positive effects on things like weight or basal metabolic indices, BMI, for example. Then one of the things that we've been very interested in looking at is some of the rigidity kind of behaviors that occur in Prader-Willi syndrome patients. And this can include things like behavioral rigidity. You know, if there's a change in the schedule, let's say relating to mealtime, then people can experience a lot of discomfort, and then they may protest and then have a temper tantrum, for example. And the change in the environmental schedule of mealtime may be behavioral rigidity. We can look at, you know, how rigid cognitive beliefs are, or cognitive rigidity, and then we can also look at the protest relating to the rigidity. And then finally, we're looking at some measures of global improvement in Prader-Willi syndrome. And we're using this clinician global impression improvement scale and the caregiver strain questionnaire to look at sort of global measures of improvement with CBDV versus placebo. Next slide. So what are the potential side effects of this CBDV? First, this particular plant-based compound is packaged in an oil, and it's administered in a liquid form. And the oil that it's packaged in sometimes can have some mild effects on the GI system. Sometimes it can cause a slight loosening, for example, of bowels. One of the things that we look for also is fatigue. So I know that fatigue and drowsiness may be important symptoms that occur in individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome, often associated with things like narcolepsy or difficulty with sleeping, and then people can be tired during the day. We want to make sure that the CBDV doesn't cause any increase in drowsiness or fatigue. You know, in the work that we've done with autism, we haven't seen significant effects on that. And then in the package insert, there are some individuals who complained of some headaches, so we want to look at that as a possible adverse event as well. Next slide. So as part of the study, we want to demonstrate that there's some efficacy or some benefit, and we want to determine whether the effectiveness or the benefit outweighs any potential side effects. We are doing some routine safety labs, which include blood work, and this may be done at screening and at weeks 4, 8, and 12 during the study. One of the things that we're measuring, for example, is to make sure that there's no increase, for example, in liver functions on routine blood work. We also do routine electrocardiogram or EKG or ECG, which is done at baseline and at endpoint in the study. We have an independent data safety monitoring committee, which includes medical specialists and statisticians and other experts who have the ability to review the data as it's coming in during the study and look to see whether or not there are any trends in terms of any of the safety data while the study is ongoing. And then we also have the study doctor who has discussions with the subject and family members at each of the study visits to carefully assess and make sure that individuals aren't having any side effects or adverse events. Next slide. So here's the design of the study. People are screened and they come in and they're randomized. When they're randomized, they either receive the cannabidivarin in this liquid form twice a day, or they will receive a placebo that looks and tastes similar to the cannabidivarin. The study itself is of 12 weeks duration. Then after the active form of this study, then we take people off of the CBDV or the placebo, and then we have them come in 2 weeks later, and we're looking on whether or not any improvement or changes that occurred while they were on the active medicine, whether people relapse or whether symptoms come back, for example, after they're taken off of the medication. Next slide. So the study visits, patients are assessed every 2 weeks. There's a total of 9 visits as part of the whole study. The medicine and the placebo comes in an oral solution, and it's a weight-based dose, so people can get 2.5 milligrams per kilogram as the starting dose, and then they titrate up to 5 milligrams per kilogram, and then 7.5 milligrams per kilogram, and then up to a maximum of 10 milligrams per kilogram per day over a 4-week time period. And then they stay on the same dose for an additional 8 weeks during the length of the clinical trial. Next slide. In terms of the inclusion criteria, one of the things that I would highlight is that, you know, we know that patients with Prader-Willi syndrome have a whole range of, you know, weights. There are some individuals who come in that are overweight or obese. but there are other individuals who have good behavioral control, and they may not have overweight or obesity type symptoms. And sometimes families can be disappointed because if they're not, if the individuals are not obese, they may not be eligible for the study. In this particular study, there's no BMI cutoff or weight-based cutoff. So even if people are not obese, they would still be eligible for the study. Also, in some studies, there may be a nutritional phase criteria cutoff so that they have to come in with significant hyperphagia. In this study, there's no hyperphagia or nutritional phase criteria, so people can come in, you know, if they have severe hyperphagia or if they don't have severe hyperphagia, they can come in if they have obesity or if they don't have obesity. Next slide. In order to get into this study, though, you do need to have a diagnosis of Prader-Willi syndrome confirmed by the genetic testing. And patients may also have some level of irritability as assessed by this aberrant behavior checklist irritability subscale, because the irritability is sort of a primary outcome measure, and it's been shown that compounds like CBDV may be very helpful for irritability. So that's our primary target, and people need to have some level of irritability or to have some level of protest or temper tantrums or discomfort, often when there's a deviation from expectations. The other interesting point about the exclusion criteria is that we are studying children and adolescents, age 5 to 17, but we're also including young adults up to age 30. And young adults, unfortunately, often are not included in other studies, but we are reaching out and including young adults in this study. Now, in order to determine whether or not, you know, this particular intervention or treatment is really effective, what we need to do is we need to try to keep other things stable prior to the study and throughout the duration of the study. So people can be on other medicines or have other kinds of dietary interventions or behavioral treatments, but we want the other medicines or dietary or behavioral interventions to be stable for 4 weeks prior to start of the study and then through the duration of the study. And then we also do a physical and laboratory tests, and we don't want people to have active or unstable medical problems, which might interfere with the conduct of the trial as well. Next slide. Primary exclusion criteria is if they've had a investigational or research medicine in the 30 days before getting randomized in this particular study. If they've been on long-term treatment with CBD or CBDV or some other treatment that affects the cannabinoid system, that would be an exclusion. If their primary psychiatric disorder is the biggest problem and not Prader-Willi syndrome, if they have a history of significant drug abuse, if they have a medical condition that would affect their ability to participate in the study, and if they have significant blood or EKG abnormalities. Next slide. And if families or subjects are interested in participating in the trial, or if they want more information, they can contact our study psychologist, Dr. Bonnie Taylor, and her telephone number is 718-839-7530, and her email address is botaylor@montefiore.org. So again, that sort of is the conclusion or the summary of our study, CBDV versus placebo, in children and adults with Prader-Willi syndrome, which is funded by the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research and for which we're actively recruiting at this time. And thank you, Susan. I'd be glad to answer any questions that may come up. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hollander. As we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, if you have questions, you're welcome to submit them to us by typing them into your GoToWebinar control panel. Those questions will come to me and we'll get through all of them today before we conclude the webinar. So I do have a few questions in the queue that we can go ahead and begin with. Actually, we have a couple questions here that are related to whether this drug is given by prescription or if it's an investigational new drug or if it is a supplement. Could you clarify that?
Okay, well, it's an investigational drug. It's administered as part of a study. We have an IND from the Food and Drug Administration. So it's not a nutritional supplement. It's not available outside of this study. So it's not something that can be prescribed outside the study, and it's not included in other sort of nutritional supplements. The only way to get this investigational medicine is to participate in this particular clinical trial.
Wonderful. So if a person is to do the study and they enjoy the benefits or that they observe in their loved one, will this be available after the study, or is it only available during the time that they are participating?
Well, at this point, the CBDV would only be available at the time that they're participating. There is a related compound, the particular form of CBD called Epidiolex, which is currently prescribed for 2 rare forms of epilepsy. And it's possible that we may be able to help in terms of being able to get maybe insurance reimbursement for that particular product after people participate in the trial. Although it's a related compound, but it's different from the particular study compound. So right now, in order to get this particular compound, they have to participate in the clinical trial.
Great. For this particular study, is there travel assistance available for people who need to perhaps travel in?
Well, that's it's a good point, because we have kind of worked with other organizations that have helped us in terms of travel support, and we have a budget in one of our other studies. In this particular study, we don't have a large budget for travel-related costs. So currently, we're not able to reimburse people for if there's extended travel costs. We are able to, reimburse people for local travel costs. I guess it could change in the future if we're able to work with some other organization that could provide some additional support for travel-related costs for those people who have to travel further distances.
Right. How long do you plan to be recruiting for this study?
Well, we plan to recruit for at least 1 year, maybe up to 18 months.
And what is the size of the study? How many patients are you looking for?
We're looking for 36 subjects.
And what will the next steps be after the conclusion of this study? If CBDV is shown to be effective for its primary endpoint, what are the next steps?
Okay, well, as I mentioned, we're looking at a few different endpoints. The primary endpoint is the irritability on the ABC irritability scale, but we're looking at improvement on repetitive behaviors or social communication or rigidity or hyperphagia as well. I think if the data looks promising, then I think that there would be an interest in doing a larger scale phase 3 type of a study that would be a multi-center study that would then sort of aim for like a FDA type of an approval. So I think if the data looks promising, that would probably be the next step.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hollander, for joining us today and sharing details on this study. As always, I encourage everyone to stay up to date on PWS clinical trials by visiting our website at fpwr.org. You can see here our clinical trials page, and if you scroll through the page, you'll see a listing of all of the different clinical trials that are currently enrolling, both interventional as well as novel drugs are available here.